Welcome back, everyone. So, how was break? I'm pretty sure you had lots of time to go and spread out and get some energy relieving back on. Yes, for sure. Mr. also had a lot of fun. So today I know we are doing through e-learning right now, and you may or may not have your book with you, and it's okay because Miss Dora will share her screen and we'll go on from there. Who remembers the vocabulary words we talked about before you guys went on break? Went to have a break, went to have your little recess. Does it give you guys a couple minutes to think? Yes, Kaden. Yes, good job. I agree with you. We did talk about the word aspiring or promote or preceded. All of those words. Yes, we talked about those and you guys wrote them in your ELA journal and you guys kind of wrote what you guys think the words mean. And then you guys quickly reviewed if that was what the word meant or not and see how close you were to it. All right. So then, with that being said, we are going to be reading the story Who Created Democracy. But today, Miss Thor is going to be only reading. Because remember, today's our first read. So Miss Thor is going to be reading only while everyone's going to, you can follow along in your book if you have it. If you don't have it, then Miss Thor will share her screen and you can follow along on the screen. So that way we are actively listening to Miss Thor and we are seeing what she's reading so we could see how what the words that we didn't know what look like, how it's put in the sentence as Miss Dory is reading it. Okay, so before I start, I want to ask a really big question. How did democracy develop? That's the one question I want you guys to be thinking about while Miss Dory is going to be reading through this story. Think about how did democracy develop? And that being said, the story is now going to share her screen and we will be reading. Who created democracy? Before we ask the question, who created democracy, perhaps we should ask another question first. Just what exactly is democracy? A democracy is a form of government in which the people take part in governing themselves. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power or authority. When you put those two words together, democracy can be translated to literally mean people power or rule by the people. Thousands of years ago, when people first began to live in communities and cities, they looked for ways to create rules and laws for everyone to follow. Many of these early cities and civilizations had autocratic governments. The word autocracy is the opposite of democracy, comes from Greek words kratos and autos meaning self. In the autocratic government, one person holds all the powers. Sometimes he or she governs without consent of the people. So how do people win the right to govern themselves? In other words, who created democracy? To find the answer to this question, we must journey back in time to a city-state of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. In 700 BC, there was no Greek word for democracy. It didn't exist for the same reason that the Greek word for computer didn't exist. It had not yet been imagined. For the wealthy citizens of Athens, there was no reason to imagine it. The social system of the city was based on wealth rather than aristocratic birth. Rich landowners relaxed on enormous estates. They grew olives, grapes, and other crops. Their fields attended by the slaves, and they made the laws for everyone else. Only the rich were a part of the oligarchy that ruled Athens. An oligarchy is a government that is ruled by only a few people. Yet most Athenians were not rich. Many struggled to grow crops on their tiny farm and plots of land. If they could not pay their taxes, they were forced to borrow the money. If they couldn't pay their debts, family members were often sold into slavery. By 630 BC, the poor of Athens were becoming angry and frustrated. In the weekly marketplace, they met and traded not only food, but stories of broken families. They grumbled about debts they could never be paid. In time, the conversation turned into action. The wealthy members of the oligarchy knew that they could not fight the poor. They were outnumbered. If they had to make changes before Athens headed straight for a civil war. Taxation without representation. Over 1,000 years later, in 1765, debt was also on the mind of Great Britain King George III. He had just fought an expensive war to defend his American colonies in the French and Indian War. Instead of being grateful, however, the colonists were aspiring to rule themselves. They began by forming assemblies they hadn't been approved by the British Parliament. So Parliament passed a Stamp Act. This required colonists to buy stamp and attach it to every piece of paper they used, from newspaper to magazines to playing cards. The king believed this would refill the British treasury. It would also remind the colonists who was in charge. The colonists, however, became furious, not over the amount of tax, but over the idea that Britain thought it had the right to tax citizens who could not vote for their representatives in Parliament. The colonists withstood this assault on their freedom by demanding that the king repeal the Stamp Act. This was followed by protests in the streets of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Many people burned the hate and the hated stamps. Seeing the hostile reactions of the colonies, the British government repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766. By the same time, it passed a declaratory act, which was said that Great Britain was superior to American colonies in all cases whatsoever. In other words, Britain could raise taxes on colonies whenever it felt like it. Anger by the 13 American colonies began to bubble over. If the colonists didn't have a vote on Britain's parliament, why should they follow the laws it approved? Soon whispers of war were passed from person to person in the shops and the harbors in American cities and villages. The situation was spinning out of control. A new government for Athens. By 600 BC, the situation in Athens was also spinning out of control. The wealthy landowners knew they had to find a way to calm the city and quiet the protests that erupted almost daily. In 594 BC, for reasons that remain obscure, they turned to a man named Solon for help. Solon was a landowner. He had built a fortune working for many years as a trader. But he had also been poor. For this reason, he was able to build a bridge between the classes. At first, there was great speculation about what Solomon could do with power that had been given to him. But Solomon surprised everyone. First, he changed the debtors' law. Athenians would no longer have to sell family members into slavery to settle debts. Then, Solomon began to change government and society. He divided citizens into four classes based on how much their farms produced. Now, people were able to move into another class by growing more food. In this new system, people in the first two classes were able to run for government office. The wealthy were no longer in charge of making laws for everybody. Many people like Solon had done, but not everyone. The wealthy were not happy about having to share power. The lowest class could still not participate in government and make laws. Would the new Athenian government survive? The Revolutionary War begins. In contrast to the Athenian crisis in 594 BC, the colonial crisis in September 1774 could not be solved by one person. In months that had preceded the crisis, Britain had closed the Boston harbor, thinking it would teach the colonists a lesson. Without their harbor, the people of Boston could not send or receive goods. But instead of giving the Britain, the American colonies boldly sent representatives to General Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The colonists fired off a letter to King George III asking for a voice in Parliament. In April 1775, the king sent British troops to Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons that had been stored there. The colonists saw only one way forward. They began preparations to wage war against the powerful country in the world. It was a war based on principle idea that citizens should have a say in the government. Thomas Jefferson argued the case elegantly when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Every man who signed that document on July 4th, 1776, was guilty of treason in the eyes of the British. As the British army marched over towards Lexington, Massachusetts, a small band of colonists gathered to meet them. A British officer ordered the colonists to drop their weapons and leave. Suddenly, as the colonists turned to go, a shot rang. The Revolutionary War had begun. In 561 BC, another powerful man sent troops, this time to Athens. Persisterus was rich and powerful. With the help of his soldier, he took control of the city of Solon. In short, 34 years after Solon reforms, Athenians' democracy stumbled. The people had no control over what Persisterus did, and he began to restrict their rights. When his son Hippias took control over the death, the wealthy landowners in Athens hired an army to remove Hippias from power. Then asked a man named Cleisthenes, who helped defeat Hippias for his ideas about the government. Cleisthenes wanted a government run by the people. He made sweeping changes. First, he reformed what he's called assembly, which became a city's lawmaking body. Every citizen, rich or poor, got a vote there. Assembly meeting occurred when hillside outside Athens every 10 days where laws and taxes debated. No laws were passed into Athens unless they were approved by the assembly. In 507 BC, Cleinias also formed a council of 500 to run by the daily business of Athens. Ideas for laws and taxes started in the council and were then brought up to assembly for a vote. After almost 50 years, the people of Athens had a true democracy government run by the people, a republic for Rome. While Cleinias was hard at work forming the Council of 500 across the Mediterranean Sea, the Romans were busy establishing their own republic. In 500 BC, King Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was driven from Rome, and Roman government was eventually divided among three separate branches: the Senate, the Assembly, and the consuls. The Senate was an aristocratic and partisan branch of government. Roman senator from the Latin Rome senex, meaning old man, were partitioners chosen by the council and advisors. Their number started about 300, but grew over the years of the Republic. The Senate controlled how much money the government spent, and because its members served for life, it became more powerful over time. And Assembly, the democratic branch of government. The earliest Roman assembly was made up of only partitions so the plebeians of working class established an assembly of their own. They were tired of having only limited say in government. By 287 BC, the plebeian assembly included that the partitions that created laws for Roman citizens. Since the assembly elected consuls and all consuls became senators, the assembly had a powerful branch of government over the years. Consuls, the monarchical or king-like branch of government. Two men were nominated to the Senate to elected by the assembly each year to rule Rome. They had veto powers over another, they took monthly turns ruling over the Senate, and they commanded the Roman army. After 367 BC, at least one or two had a plebeian common person. Consuls automatically became senators at the end of their terms. We the people. In 1783, after 8 years of fighting, the British surrendered, and the government ruled by the people finally became reality in America. But for a few years following the peace treaty with Great Britain and the very foundation of the newborn United States of America was threatened. As some powerful states tried to promote their ideas and force their wills into the nation, many people realized that a compromise between the government and the new federal government would be necessary. When the delegation of men finally gathered in Philadelphia for a constitutional convention in May 1787 to address the problem, they had done their homework well. They studied Solon, Clisthenes, and the government of ancient Athens. They were familiar with Rome's three-branch model government. But if they agreed on the three-branch plan, they disagreed on how the two houses of legislative branch ought to look. Should each state send out an equal number of representatives as the New Jersey plan urged, or should the Virginia plan, which proposed representatives based on the state population, be adopted? The convention was near collapse when the solution was proposed. The Senate would have the same number of representatives from each state, while the members of House and Representative would be chosen based on the population of their state. So today, Texas would have more representatives than a state such as Rhode Island. With the crisis averted, the convention produced a government much like Republic of ancient Rome. How did democracy develop? It began when the ancient Greeks and Romans tried to answer the question, who should be in charge of government? Influenced by the Greek and Romans, the writers of the U.S. Constitution answered the question in the first three words of the document wrote in 1786, we the people. So that is the end of the story. With that being said, what did we realize about the story? What did it show us? Give you guys a couple seconds to think about that. Actually, what did we see in the text? What happened first, and then what happened at the very end? Good job. It started with the Athens, and it ended with the colonists, right? Talking about we the people. So with that being said, with we the people, how was how did democracy develop? How was it developed? If we're unsure, let's go back to the very, very last page. How did the government develop? It began with ancient Greeks and Roman and tried to answer who should be in charge, right? That's how it began. And it ended with them wanting to have self-vote. We the people. We all have a voice. That's what it means, right? So then we're going to stop there, and and tomorrow we'll read it again, and we will really, really go over every little detail in the story. We'll go over text structure tomorrow. We'll go over why it's so important to know this. Why is the author using this kind of text structure tomorrow? We'll also go over exactly what Athens did to the Romans and the colonists. We'll go over all those things tomorrow after we do another read tomorrow. And today I just kind of wanted to introduce you to the story and really have you guys just think about little things that happen and the essential question. We were able to kind of answer the essential questions, but does it really make sense to us fully yet? No, but we were able to answer it. So with that being said, we are going to transition into going into deep diving into another reading right now. So with that being said, go ahead and put this book away and be prepared to take out a pencil with ELA journal, and we are going to be writing.